Why does suffering exist if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good? Does the existence of evil or suffering disprove the existence of a God? Or does it, at a minimum, require that God give up an omni-attribute? Welcome to an episode where we shine a bright, unforgiving light on claims that simply don't hold water. Today, we're putting on our demolition hats. Not for a building, but for a master's thesis that purports to refute one of the most significant arguments in the philosophy of religion, John L. Mackey's logical problem of evil. We're talking about Zachary Ellison's master's thesis, The Metaphysical Problem of Evil, submitted to the University of Texas at San Antonio. Now, Ellison states his goal right up front to reconcile the logical problem of evil and ultimately to refute Mackey's conclusion that belief in God is irrational. Folks, that's a bold claim. Mackey's argument has been a cornerstone of atheist thought for decades, so if you're going to knock it down, you better bring more than just good intentions. And spoiler alert, I don't think Ellison does. Zachary starts right out of the gate stating his thesis seeks to reconcile the logical problem of evil and refute Mackey's conclusion that belief in God is irrational. Now hold on a second. Reconcile implies there's a conflict that can be resolved. The logical problem of evil, as Mackey laid it out, isn't some minor disagreement. It's a deductive argument. If the premises are true and the argument is valid, the conclusion necessarily follows. You don't reconcile a contradiction. You identify which part of your worldview is incoherent. Ellison's goal is to say belief in God isn't irrational, but Mackey's argument for irrationality stems from a very specific set of definitions. God is omnipotent, God is entirely good, and evil exists. The implied premises are that a good being eliminates evil as far as it can, and an omnipotent being has no limits. If you accept those definitions and you acknowledge the existence of evil, then belief in such a God is irrational because it's contradictory. The only way to refute Mackey's conclusion is to demonstrate that one of his premises is false, or that the argument is invalid. Ellison attempts to do this by re-examining the metaphysical status of the premises. We'll get to that, but the burden of proof is on him to show how these fundamental definitions of God and evil can be reinterpreted without simply redefining the problem away. He says, if one were to be erroneously persuaded of a particular type of metaphysical existence, then they would preclude themselves from metaphysical possibilities without sufficient justification. This is a pretty vague statement. Erroneously persuaded? Sufficient justification? What does that even mean in a metaphysical context? From my perspective, if you're going to make claims about metaphysical existence, you need to provide evidence or a coherent, non-contradictory argument. My problem with theism, and specifically with an Anselmian God, isn't that it precludes metaphysical possibilities. It's that the concept itself, when examined logically, appears to be incoherent in the face of observed reality. What Ellison seems to be suggesting is that by rejecting a God, one might be closing off avenues of thought. I'd counter that by embracing evidence and logical rigor. You're opening up understanding because you're not shackled by unsupported assumptions. The justification I look for is empirical, logical, and falsifiable. If your metaphysical possibilities rely on special pleading or circular reasoning, then precluding them is a feature, not a bug. Ellison goes on to state that without an Anselmian God, grasping for understanding becomes an arduous endeavor. This is a classic argument from personal incredulity or an appeal to convenience. The idea here is that God makes understanding the world easier, therefore God must exist. Hogwash. First, just because something is arduous doesn't make it untrue. Science, by its very nature, is often arduous. It requires meticulous observation, experimentation, and revision. If understanding the universe were easy, we'd have figured it all out by now. Second, for whom does it become arduous? For those who have been conditioned to believe that God is the answer to all questions, perhaps, but for countless scientists, philosophers, and thinkers throughout history, grappling with the universe without invoking a divine entity has led to profound understanding. Look at cosmology, quantum physics, evolutionary biology, neuroscience. These fields don't require an Anselmian God to grasp for understanding. In fact, positing an unexplained supernatural entity often halts inquiry by simply saying, God did it. This claim seems to confuse a desire for simple answers with actual understanding. It's an emotional appeal, not a logical one. He then says, if one could definitively prove God does or does not exist, we would know what kind of world we live in. Okay, let's unpack this. We already know a tremendous amount about what kind of world we live in through scientific inquiry, regardless of whether a God exists. We understand the laws of physics, the mechanisms of biology, the history of the universe. This understanding comes from observation and experimentation, not from a definitive proof or disproof of God. The statement implies that the fundamental nature of reality hinges on God's existence. While certain metaphysical interpretations might differ, the observable, verifiable reality remains the same. If tomorrow we definitively proved God does not exist, gravity would still work, evolution would still be a fact, and chemistry would still describe molecular interactions. Our interpretations of those facts might change for some, but the facts themselves would not. What he's really getting at is the purpose or meaning of the world, which he addresses later. But to say we don't know what kind of world we live in without this definitive proof is an overstatement and ignores the vast body of human knowledge acquired independently of theological assumptions. The watch analogy. Like a watch being created to tell time, our world would have been created to serve an end or purpose. The old watchmaker analogy, dusted off and presented as if it's a novel insight. This is probably one of the most thoroughly debunked arguments for design, and I've taken it apart more times than I can count. The fundamental flaw is that it assumes what it needs to prove. A watch is demonstrably designed. We know watches are made by watchmakers. The universe, on the other hand, is not demonstrably designed. To say it's like a watch, therefore it has a creator, is to commit the fallacy of analogy. The two things being compared, watch and universe, are not analogous in the critical aspect. We have empirical evidence of one being designed, and we have none for the other. Furthermore, we now have robust scientific explanations for the apparent complexity and order in the universe that do not require a designer. Natural selection explains the apparent design in living organisms. The laws of physics, which emerged naturally from the Big Bang, explain cosmic order. We don't need a magical watchmaker in the sky to explain how the universe works. And even if we accept the analogy for a moment, it raises more questions than it answers. Who designed the watchmaker? Is the designer perfect? Given the bad stuff going on in the world, as Ellison himself acknowledges, what kind of designer creates something with so much suffering and apparent inefficiency? If the world has a purpose, what is it, and why is it so obscure? This analogy is not a metaphysical insight. It's a rhetorical trick to smuggle in the conclusion of a creator without any supporting evidence. Ellison says, the implication here is that every created thing has a reason for its existence, so your life has a meaning and a purpose. This is a leap, a desperate attempt to link the assumed purpose of a created world to individual human meaning, even if we grant the premise that the world was created with a purpose, which I don't. It doesn't automatically mean your life has a predefined purpose. My life has meaning and purpose because I give it meaning and purpose. I find meaning in my relationships, in pursuing knowledge, in contributing to society, in advocating for reason and compassion. This meaning isn't imposed from an external, undemonstrated entity. It's something I actively construct. The idea that life is meaningless without a divine purpose is a terrifying and ultimately unsupported assertion. It's a tactic often used to make people cling to religious belief out of fear of nihilism. But nihilism only follows if you accept the premise that meaning must be external and divinely bestowed. If meaning is an emergent property of conscious experience and human interaction, then the absence of God changes nothing about our capacity to live fulfilling, purposeful lives. He goes on to say that the Anselmian God sufficiently satisfies the needs of the prime mover argument. and he satisfies the requirements of the prime mover. He justifies PSR, and by extension ensures that every individual life has meaning and purpose. This is where the circularity starts to become blatant. The prime mover argument, or cosmological argument, posits that everything has a cause, and therefore there must be an uncaused first cause. Then they simply label that first cause God. My question is always, why stop there? If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. If God doesn't need a cause, then why does the universe? You're just asserting a special exemption for your preferred entity. It's an argument from ignorance. I don't know how the universe started, therefore God did it. That's not satisfying any needs. It's merely stopping inquiry at a convenient point. As for justifying PSR, principle of sufficient reason, Ellison defines PSR as for every fact, F, there must be a sufficient reason why F is the case. He then claims that if PSR is true, then notions of nihilism go away and life has purpose. But the PSR itself is a philosophical principle that has its own challenges and isn't universally accepted without qualification. To say God justifies it is to presuppose God's existence as the ultimate reason, again committing circular reasoning. Ellison is essentially saying, if God exists, then all these other good things, purpose, explanation, fall into place. But the existence of God is precisely what's in question. You can't use the benefits of God's existence as evidence for God's existence. That's putting the cart before the horse. The meteorologist analogy for omniscience. Is the meteorologist causing the rain? No, they are not influencing the weather, and their knowledge of the weather does not cause the weather. God may know the outcome absolutely without having any influence on the agent's ability to choose. This analogy, while seemingly clever, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of divine omniscience in the context of free will and responsibility. A meteorologist observes and predicts natural phenomena based on existing laws and conditions. They are an external observer. They have no control over the weather. Their knowledge is passive. God, in the Anselmian sense, is not a passive observer. God is the creator of the universe, the sustainer of existence, the author of the very laws of nature. If God knows an outcome absolutely and without having any influence, and then it means God created a system where that outcome was always going to happen. If God is truly omniscient and knows every future choice you will make, then those choices are, in effect, already determined by God's knowledge. If your choice could genuinely be otherwise, then God's absolute knowledge would be imperfect, which contradicts omniscience. If God's knowledge is absolute, then the outcome must occur as God knows it. And if God also created the conditions that lead to that outcome, then how is that not a form of causal influence, even if indirect? The analogy breaks down because God isn't merely predicting. God is, by definition, intimately involved in the very fabric of reality that produces these outcomes. This isn't a mere philosophical quibble. It's a central tension in theological metaphysics that the meteorologist analogy completely sidesteps. Ellison says, therefore, one can have a world with a truly omniscient Anselmian God while satisfying the demands of PSR, while also sufficiently free to have moral agents. This is the big claim, and it's asserted, not demonstrated. This is precisely the kind of problem I've spent years discussing. The compatibility of divine attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, with human free will and the existence of evil is the Gordian knot of theodicy. Ellison simply declares it possible without doing the philosophical heavy lifting required to actually show how it's possible. The tensions between perfect foreknowledge and genuine libertarian free will are profound. If God knows exactly what you'll do, how can you genuinely choose otherwise? If you could choose otherwise, then God's knowledge of the future was fallible, meaning God wasn't truly omniscient. And as for satisfying the demands of PSR, if God determines everything, then PSR is trivially satisfied. But if there's genuine indeterminism for free will, then PSR, as stated, for every fact, F, there must be a sufficient reason why F is the case, is challenged unless the sufficient reason for a free choice is simply the agent's uncaused will. But then that leads to other problems for PSR. Ellison is essentially waving his hand and saying, it just works, when this is the central intractable problem that centuries of philosophers have grappled with. The evidential argument fails. The evidence of evil, when measured against the divine attributes and the possibility of an infinite good, it is still reasonable to conclude that the greater good outweighs the evil, and the evil was either instrumental or unavoidable to the outcome. This is the classic appeal to mystery or greater good defense, and it's frankly intellectually dishonest. When Rowe presents his evidential problem, he points to instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. He's talking about gratuitous evil, suffering that appears to serve no purpose. And Ellison's response is essentially, you can't know that. He argues that humans are quite bad at recognizing distant consequences of actions, and that God's reasons might be beyond our understanding. He invokes an infinite good, like heaven, that supposedly justifies all suffering. This is a faith-based dodge. If your argument rests on the idea that God has a reason, we just can't know it, then your position is unfalsifiable and immune to any evidence. It moves the goalpost into an unknowable realm. If any evil can be justified by an unknown greater good, then the problem of evil ceases to be a problem, not because it's solved, but because you've redefined God's benevolence to be compatible with anything. If God is truly omnibenevolent and omnipotent, why would he choose to achieve this greater good through such horrific suffering, when he supposedly has infinite other ways to accomplish his goals? The claim that the greater good outweighs the evil is an assertion without demonstration. And why is the suffering always seemingly random and disproportionate? This isn't a failure of the evidential argument, it's a failure to provide a coherent, rational defense against it. It's an admission that the theist has no actual answer, only a post hoc rationalization. The court case analogy in Jones and the coffee thermos he provides has problems too. Ellison uses the court case analogy to argue that the evidential problem, like circumstantial evidence, cannot prove without a doubt that God does not or cannot exist. He says, if you were to imagine a court case against God's existence, the prosecution would not have direct evidence which definitively proves there is no God, but would instead present as much circumstantial evidence as possible so that God's existence would be incredibly unlikely based on the substantial quantity of evidence. It would not be rational to believe that God exists. However, the issue with the evidential problem of evil is that while it can argue the existence of God is unlikely, it cannot prove definitively that there is no God. He then uses the Jones and the coffee thermos analogy to show that inductive reasoning can lead to incorrect conclusions. His coffee thermos analogy goes like this. Your coworker Jones might come to work every day with a thermos full of coffee. You might not even have a memory in which said coworker did not have a cup of coffee. Thus, you might conclude surely Jones loves coffee, so you will get Jones a gift card for the local coffee shop for the company gift exchange. What you did not know is that Jones hates coffee and only drinks coffee because he suffers from narcolepsy, and coffee is the only beverage disgusting enough to keep him from nodding off. In this case, through accurate observations and good reasoning, you gave Jones a gift card to buy the substance he hates the most. My response to this is twofold. In a court of law, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. In the case of God, the burden of proof is on the person making the positive claim that God exists. I, as an atheist, am not claiming to know God doesn't exist. I'm saying there's insufficient evidence to justify belief. The circumstantial evidence of evil or lack of divine intervention simply adds to the lack of positive evidence for God. It's not about proving non-existence beyond a reasonable doubt. It's about whether the claim of existence meets its burden. The Jones analogy highlights that inductive reasoning isn't always perfect, agreed, but we use inductive reasoning all the time to make rational decisions, especially when the stakes are high. And as Ellison admits, the stakes with God's existence are much bigger. Therefore, the standard of evidence should be higher, not lower, for such a significant claim. Relying on an infinite good that is beyond our understanding is not meeting a higher standard. it's abandoning any standard at all. The analogy implies that there's a truth about God, like Jones's narcolepsy, that we just don't know, and our observations are misleading. But for God, there's no independent way to verify that truth. It's just an assertion that there might be a hidden explanation. That's a God of the gaps argument, and it's not convincing. Ellison claims, every time you witness a case of suffering interrupted or evil denied, it ought to be considered as evidence that there is a benevolent God out there doing the absolute best metaphysically possible. This is perhaps one of the most egregious examples of confirmation bias and special pleading in the thesis. Ellison states, if a rabbit is burned up in a wildfire, this act of evil is presented as evidence against the existence of God. But if a wildfire sweeps through Oklahoma and all my friends' livestock emerge miraculously unharmed, surely this is evidence of beneficence. This is a classic heads I win, tails you lose argument. If something bad happens, it's excused by greater good or mystery. If something good happens, it's attributed to God. This isn't how evidence works. If God is doing the absolute best metaphysically possible, then why isn't every instance of suffering interrupted? Why do children die of agonizing diseases? Why do tsunamis wipe out hundreds of thousands? If God is constantly intervening to prevent evil, why is there so much of it? The moments of good are indistinguishable from random chance or natural processes. When a house is saved from a fire by a change in wind direction, is that God's beneficence or meteorology? Furthermore, if this benevolent God is doing the absolute best metaphysically possible, that means the world we live in with all its horrors is the best possible world. Think about that for a second. The Holocaust, genocides, pandemics, child abuse, natural disasters, this is the best God can do? If that's the case, then God's absolute best isn't very good, and it certainly undermines the notion of an all-good, all-powerful being. This claim requires ignoring the overwhelming amount of suffering that isn't interrupted and then selectively highlighting events that can be interpreted as positive outcomes. Ellison goes on to use a lifeguard analogy. If God is the lifeguard on a beach of metaphysical space and every instance of drowning is an act of evil, it would not be reasonable to ask the lifeguard to save every single life all at once. He might be required to save as many as he can, and you might even chastise him for not saving enough, but he is the only lifeguard on this infinite beach with lots of drowning people. This analogy is deeply flawed when applied to an omnipotent God. A human lifeguard has physical limitations. They can only be in one place at a time, have finite energy, and can't instantly teleport or defy physics. God, by definition, is omnipotent. An omnipotent being isn't constrained by physical limitations or the need to swim to save someone. The analogy attempts to humanize God's power, thereby diminishing it to fit the problem. If God is truly all-powerful, why is there any drowning on the infinite beach? He could snap his fingers and save everyone simultaneously. More fundamentally, God isn't just a lifeguard. God is the one who created the infinite beach and filled it with lots of drowning people. If God is benevolent, why create a beach where people are destined to drown in the first place? Why not create a beach where no one drowns or where everyone can inherently swim? The analogy shifts the responsibility from the creator to a mere responder. Ellison claims it's not reasonable to require God to do more than is metaphysically possible. This is the core of his argument, that evil is either necessary or necessarily possible. If evil is necessarily possible and must obtain in some worlds, then God is supposedly bound by these modal laws. But who created these modal laws? If God is the creator of everything, including metaphysical necessities, as some Cartesian views hold, which he discusses, then God established a universe where evil must occur. In that case, God is still responsible. If God didn't create these necessities, then God isn't truly omnipotent in the traditional sense, and the problem simply shifts to the nature of these uncreated necessities. And didn't he create these worlds? This is a critical point that Ellison's thesis either overlooks or tries to dance around with these abstract notions of necessarily possible evil. if we're talking about an Anselmian God, the being than which no greater is possible, then this isn't just some cosmic bystander. This isn't a lifeguard who just shows up to an existing beach. This is the entity who, by definition, is the source of all existence. So, if there are many possible worlds, as Ellison himself grants, didn't God have to decide on which world was created? This isn't some passive act, like a moviegoer choosing a film from a list of pre-existing options. God, being omnipotent, isn't simply picking from a predetermined shelf of possibilities. He's the architect of the very possibilities themselves, at least in some sense. If God is truly omnipotent and entirely good, then he could have created a world in which intense suffering was prevented without losing some greater good or permitting an equal or worse evil. He could have created a world where gratuitous evil, that evil which serves no purpose at all, simply doesn't exist. A world where fawns aren't burned alive in wildfires for no discernible greater purpose. A world where children don't suffer agonizing diseases. Yet, he chose to create this world with its magnitude, duration, and distribution of actual evil. This world where, as Ellison describes, there are wars, there is violence against the innocent and other equally evil things afoot. And if evil exists and God is perfectly good and powerful, then the logical conclusion is that he chose to allow this specific kind and amount of evil, even if a better world was metaphysically available to him. And if he could have created a world with less suffering or no gratuitous suffering and didn't, then how exactly is he entirely good? That's the fundamental contradiction Mackey points out. Ellison's attempts to make evil necessary or necessarily possible only push the problem back. Why did an omnibenevolent God create a universe where such a necessity exists, especially when there's no independent logical proof that such a necessity must exist for a truly omnipotent being? Doesn't it follow that either God doesn't care about the suffering of humans, can't do anything to prevent it, or doesn't exist? The lifeguard analogy attempts to evoke sympathy for God, portraying him as overwhelmed by a difficult task, when the very definition of God precludes such limitations. It's a deflection, not a solution. Ellison then claims, if evil is necessarily possible, then it must obtain in some worlds, and no world has more claim to be free of evil than any other, which means one cannot fault God for any case of evil because no being has any superiority to say that they ought not to experience evil and that another should. This is the linchpin of Ellison's argument against the logical and evidential problems of evil. He's saying that if evil is necessarily possible, then it's beyond God's complete control. But let's be precise here. What does necessarily possible actually mean in this context? He defines it as the modal property of having to occur in at least some worlds. And if it must occur in some world, then God can't stamp out all evil. This is a monumental claim that requires far more justification than it exists in some worlds. What makes evil necessarily possible? Is it a logical necessity, like a square has to have four sides? Ellison doesn't establish this. If it's not logically necessary, then what makes it necessarily possible? Is it a brute fact? If so, why is it a brute fact for God? If God is omnipotent, then he should be able to create a world where evil doesn't occur, even if it's possible for it to occur in some other hypothetical world. The idea that God, being perfectly good and all-powerful, is somehow forced to allow evil to exist in this world because it's necessarily possible is a severe limitation on his attributes. It means God is not truly all-powerful over the existence of evil, or not truly all good if he allows necessary evil when he could have created a different necessity. Even if evil must exist in some world, why this world? Why these people? Ellison says, no being has any superiority to say that they ought not to experience evil and that another should. This is a bizarre moral argument. If a truly benevolent being could choose which world to actualize, and there are worlds without gratuitous evil, why actualize one that includes it? This argument essentially says, don't complain about your suffering because someone else had to suffer and it just happened to be you. That's not a defense of God's beneficence. It's a cold, detached, and morally reprehensible conclusion. This entire argument hinges on an unsubstantiated metaphysical claim about the nature of evil. It's a retreat from the problem, not a solution. It says God can't do that when the whole point of omnipotence is that God can do anything that's not logically contradictory. And if evil's non-existence is not logically contradictory, then the argument falls apart. Ellison states, all other notions of a world without evil at all are much like the beloved consulting detective Sherlock Holmes, fun to think about, but entirely theoretical. This is a dangerous analogy for Ellison to use. He implies that a world without evil is a fiction, an impossible concept, like a character that never existed. But Sherlock Holmes is fictional because he exists only in stories. A world without evil is something an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being, by definition, should be able to create, unless the existence of evil is a logical necessity, which he doesn't prove. If a world without evil is truly impossible for an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, then the very definition of that God is incoherent. It means God is either not truly omnipotent, he's limited by necessary evil, or not truly omnibenevolent. He chooses to allow evil when he could have prevented it or chosen a different necessity. To compare a perfectly good world, actualized by a perfectly good and powerful God, to a fictional detective is to concede the very point the problem of evil makes, that such a God and such a world are incompatible. It's a tacit admission that the concept of God, as traditionally defined, cannot exist in a world with actual evil. Ellison goes on to refute his own thesis by stating, this is where the type of argument that Mackey created and I refuted turns out to be circular, and particularly susceptible to one's metaphysical intuitions. And if this is the case, then neither Mackey nor I could use the existence of evil to either validate or disprove our intuitions, which means this entire argument has gotten us nowhere. Or perhaps I should say we have not moved much further than our original metaphysical intuitions, and we have only better considered the situation without advancing either position. This is a profound admission. Ellison openly states that his own conclusion, that God exists and is benevolent despite evil, is influenced by his pre-existing theistic metaphysical intuitions. He acknowledges that this could lead to a badly circular argument which would invalidate the entire argument. This is almost an explicit surrender. If the argument is circular and merely affirms pre-existing biases, metaphysical intuitions, then it has no persuasive power for anyone who doesn't already share those intuitions. It fails to achieve its stated purpose of refuting Mackey's conclusion that belief in God is irrational. If the argument has gotten us nowhere in terms of advancing either position, then it certainly hasn't reconciled the problem of evil or proven that belief in God is rational. In essence, by telling on himself about the potential circularity and the influence of his own intuitions, Ellison provides a significant reason to dismiss the force of his own arguments within the thesis, effectively invalidating his refutation of Mackey for anyone not already predisposed to his conclusion. This is precisely my point about faith and reason. If your starting intuition is that God exists, and you then interpret everything, including the problem of evil, through that lens, you will always find a way to reconcile it. But that reconciliation isn't based on independent logical discovery. It's based on a pre-existing commitment. The job of philosophy and critical thinking isn't to justify pre-existing intuitions. It's to examine them, test them, and reject them if they lead to logical contradictions or are unsupported by evidence. If Ellison concludes that his argument only better considered the situation without advancing either position, then he's inadvertently admitting that the problem of evil from a logical standpoint remains unsolved for the theist who insists on defining God as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent in a world filled with gratuitous suffering. And if it's unsolved, then the claim that belief in such a God is rational is at best premature and not warranted.